Okay, and welcome everyone to another video brought to you by FM Daniel Wrench and Chess.com. We are here today to continue our brilliant mastery of Principle of Two Weaknesses and all things Principle and Twos and Weaknesses. All right, seriously though. Today we're looking at a position that really is interesting because first of all, it's one where there is no material advantage for either side before we even talk about who's better. There's no material advantage here, and you know, for all things being equal, you know, you may think a lot of people might agree to a draw in a position like this, but you know, what's interesting is you should try to think about this position and visualize it from Black's perspective. First of all, Black is better here. In fact, he's much better. The very fact that White's pawns are all on light squares gives Black a huge advantage. And but the question is, how does he proceed? The path to into his opponent's camp is not clear. You'd like to enter through the h5 square, but his bishop on d1 is guarding it. You'd like to maybe just win some of these light square pawns, but the bishop alone can't force the king, you know, away from either the e or the c pawn. So where is our second weakness, first of all? Well, even though our king is all the way in Chinatown over here, the way into our enemy's camp, believe it or not, is through the a file. I really like this game because, first of all, it's the same color bishop ending with completely equal material, but easily winning for one side when they're patient, when they set their goals, and again, this concept of Principle of Two Weaknesses. The nice thing about this one, too, is you're going to notice that White's two weaknesses, technically here, are not even necessarily the two pawns on the far ends of the board. Sometimes when you hear Principle of Two Weaknesses, you think about, you know, breakthrough on one side, and then blah, 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 and then breakthrough on the other side, and do what you got to do, and balance back and forth. And a lot of times that is the case, because when you can create a target on the other side of the board, it tends to break down your opponent's defense better. It's harder to deal with. However, here, White's major long-term problems are what? I mean, if you think about it, what are they? They're the light square pawns, because the pawns on the same color as your bishop are going to be the ones that are easiest for you to target. And by a series of zugzwang and getting him to have to guard more than one thing, he will have to give your bishop an optimal attacking place for these pawns. Believe it or not, one of these two diagonals for one of those pawns. So the question is, how do we create this? Now, to start this position, it was actually White to move, and White sort of recognized what the problem was going to be, and he actually played the move a5. We're going to come back to that in the real game, but first thing we're going to do is I'm going to try to execute here as quickly as I can. I know my videos are long, but we're going to try to execute here as quickly as I can. What would have happened if White hadn't done that? What if White just waited and played bishop e2, for example, keeping the bishop on this long diagonal, stopping the king from getting in, obviously. Black had played b6, which would have been a good move because it stops now a5, stops it from happening, thus fixing 3 pawns on the light squares. And let's say White played bishop d1 and just continued to be stubborn. Well, the nice thing about this position is that by putting all his pawns on light squares and being stubborn, he's given us all the time in the world to decide. And if you take the time to recognize your goals, which is to get your king here, whether you know you're going to win that pawn or not, it's obvious that that pawn is on a light square, whereas this pawn is not. And that if you get your king there, you're clearly going to have better chances of breaking through because that pawn is a light square target. Sometimes, one of the best things I learned from a grandmaster who taught me for a few months was that sometimes, you know, in life and chess, you know, you can't solve the position all the way to the end. And in fact, trying to do so is not only impractical because of time pressure, those sort of things, but maybe impossible depending on how well you can calculate. But what you can do, again, it comes back to this building a bridge calculation where if you can recognize, all right, you know, I came to the river, I need to get to the other side, and that's all you know. That's your goal. If I just get my king to a5, I know that my winning chances are improved before I even do any sort of deep calculation. I've established that he's not going to be able to break through over here with his king because of the threat on this pawn and because my pawn and bishop guard the squares. So as long as there's nothing to worry about, why shouldn't I just start the journey of bringing my king to the other side of the board and see what happens from there? And I think this is a good psychological concept to have. I think sometimes, especially for players who reach like the 1800 to 2200 level, where you're starting to become a pretty good good player. You're much better than the average player, but you haven't quite mastered the game yet. You're not a master yet, and you're not, close to the title player level. But you can calculate deeper. So you start to push yourself to really try to solve things to the end. But sometimes it's mission impossible. Sometimes, the best thing about GMs is that they don't try to solve everything to the end. They recognize goals very quickly. They recognize patterns very quickly. They recognize these permanent and positional weaknesses on light squares very quickly, and they allow the game to play itself. Also, one of the things I mentioned in one of the first couple of videos was talking about if you keep your opponent in a bad position, what happens? They blunder, right? So, you might as well try this king a5 idea, whether it's winning or not. So this is instructive. I like the fact that the king comes all the way over the other side of the board. Bishop e2, king f6, bishop d1, king e7, king c3, king to d7, king to d3. Here black plays h6, kind of takes a little bit of time. White plays bishop to e2, black plays king to c7, white plays king to a3, black plays king to b3. Sorry, king to b7, king to b3 for white, king to a6, king to b2, king to a5, and king to a3. So we've achieved this position, and the obvious thing of playing bishop d7 might as well be played, because you attack the pawn and make him play bishop d1. But we still haven't necessarily established how, just the fact that his pawns are on the same color square as our bishop, how that's a huge advantage. But believe me, it is. And it's a huge advantage here. You just have to recognize that his options are very limited. He can't let your king come in either way. He can't lose a pawn, because that's going to be enough for you to start creating pass pawns. So here, black now plays this move bishop e8, which is pointing out the fact that white's bishop now has to stay on this diagonal. And one thing you might notice is that with the bishop on this diagonal, he's getting a little bit tight. He has to guard 3 pawns. So the question is, how can we relocate our bishop where we get him in some sort of zugzwang where that becomes impossible? After bishop f7, bishop goes to a2. Now bishop g6 is played, with the idea being that on bishop to b1, now you go back to e8, and all of a sudden you've achieved a zugzwang, because on bishop c2, where's your winning move? Bishop c6. Yermolinsky, who was a mentor of mine and still is, always calls this the triple step method with the bishop, where the bishop, takes advantage of the fact that he has more options than the other bishop, or a lot of times a knight, and makes a few moves, the triple step, and eventually achieves a position of zugzwang. Again, that's why, for example, that's why after bishop d7 to start, that's why white didn't play... Sorry, after bishop d1, the reason why you didn't go bishop c6 to start is because bishop c2, you've achieved nothing. So rather, black plays bishop e8. If bishop c2 was played, bishop c6 would immediately put white in zugzwang. So white did the best he could to avoid it, but in the long run, his options were too limited. Black would relocate the bishop to c6, and maybe just to give you a quick example of how easy a breakthrough would be here, once you win that pawn, not only is there options of trading down into like a king and pawn ending, which is winning, but he probably can't prevent you from starting to win other pawns as well. So, white's waiting method, despite completely equal material, will lose the game because of this long journey that our king took over to the other side of the board. And kind of, I really think it's instructive because it shows just patience and just some practical tips outside of principle two weaknesses for sure. And so we see that black does have a winning plan, especially if white, all 3 of white's pawns get stuck to the light squares. Now we understand why white played a5. And I would qualify a principle two weaknesses position here. I mean, even though it's kind of a, really more of a lesson of patience and good technique, because without targeting more than one pawn, it would not be winning. I like the balance there. I like that it shows that you have to be patient and look for your opportunity to attack 2 weaknesses at one time, or at least create 2 different problems. And of course, we don't have to consider white moving the bishop this way, because if he lets the king in, the game is over. So again, let's start with what white did. White played a5. And again, this was an interesting idea. However, it also puts the pawn on an undefended square, so our king begins a similar journey as he did before. And after bishop e2, he plays bishop to d7. King to e3 was played. King to f6 was played. White played king to f2. Perhaps he could have gone back to d3, and we can look at that later, but essentially black's plan of coming around to the queen side was the same. So after king to f2, Black played king e7. He played it for this idea. He was trying to prevent the king from coming over, which is why he went here, because his hopes were that he could play bishop g4 and either force a trade of the bishops, which would let his king in, or he would force the bishop to move away, and then White's bishop would control the diagonal and thus win the game, or at least get his king in. However, what he miscalculated was that Black simply has this move. Now, bishop g4 is not even possible because it loses the pawn, and he can't afford to give Black a passed c-pawn that quickly. So, in reality, the truth is this king f2 plan to king g3 that was played in the game by the Grandmaster, who again will rename nameless because of our witness protection program that I love. Anyway, because of the fact that he wasn't even threatening to play bishop g4, which he miscalculated, it kind of makes this whole idea of bringing the king to g3 a waste of time. But before we're done, we'll run back and look at king d3 and show you how Black was winning in either case. So after king to g3 was played, bishop to e6 was played. White starts the journey of bringing the king back to d6. Again, by the way, I tend to talk too fast, so just for all my video listeners, hopefully guys who are becoming regulars and like my stuff, and even though I don't know why. But anyway, in case you're crazy enough to like my lectures and my videos, I do talk a little fast. So if you ever have the reason to pause the video and slow down and listen to it a couple times and sort of see exactly what this idea was, if you feel that's more instructive to you, I would definitely encourage you to do that. So after king to d6, White played king e3, king to c7. Black goes all the way back to b8 after king to d3, which is kind of fun. Always fun to have a journey like this. King to c3, king to a7, bishop to d3, king to a6, and obviously White was kind of dooming his pawn to begin with when he played a5, but he was doomed the other way either way, so he tried to make it a little tricky. So after king a6, White played bishop b1. And his idea was to meet king takes a5 with bishop c2, where once again he's trying to prevent some progress by setting up a blockade. However, blockades are broken down by our principle that we're all getting good at, and that is two weaknesses. Once you create other problems, you know, he can't just sit there and hold. So what would you do here? Again, let's take a moment to pause the video. This is our first one in this video where I recommend that you take a think, whether you want to or not. I think you should pause the video and maybe try to develop a winning plan for Black. So go ahead. Okay, and we're going to assume that you did so. And now you are back and ready to go. So after bishop c2, Black first played h6, which is a nice move, just sort of a zugzwang move. Because after bishop to d1, bishop to d7, now on bishop c2, bishop a4, I think what he was trying to do with h6 was, first of all, you know, some kind of interesting prophylactic chess just takes a pawns off light square, which is always good to do, just to never have to worry about that threat again. But if you came up with the bishop d7, bishop a4 plan to force the bishop off the diagonal, that was definitely the most accurate. It should be noted, I guess, quickly that, you know, playing b5 and making a trade here is probably winning in the sense that you do have an extra pawn. However, on a principle standpoint, if your opponent has weaknesses, and they are weaknesses, they are permanent weaknesses that you want to target, you've already won one, why not try for more? Why would you trade it off? Show good technique, show some patience and discipline, and keep pushing. Again, I think a mistake a lot of people make psychologically is they get an advantage, and they think all is well that ends well, I'm just going to trade off everything. You know, all roads lead to Rome. But it's not true. Use what I said in the first couple of videos, what I teach my students, which is rather than saying the phrase simplify, say the phrase keep it simple. If it's already simple, but it takes a little more work, you got to keep outplaying your opponent, well, you just got to buckle up your belt and keep outplaying your opponent and take advantage of those weaknesses rather than just trading it off. Because when you make your opponent's defense easier, you make their psychological mindset, you know, more happy, you know, they're a little bit more comfortable, and, you know, it's easier to deal with it when they have less weaknesses. So that's why I think that keeping those pawns on the board was excellent technique. And by bringing the bishop to a4, forcing it off the diagonal, now bringing the bishop to d1, the king gains a tempo, but the bishop goes back to b3 in preparation to meet king c3 with king a4, and you have grabbed the diagonal. Let's see how the game was continued and won. Bishop e2 was played, the king gets in. I know it thinks like, well, what the heck is this guy doing? I mean, is he even going to win anything? But watch what happens here, because we didn't eliminate his weaknesses, which means his king and bishop are still stuck. He plays here, we go back. We've obviously improved our king position. He goes king c3, and we play king a2. That's right. It's around the world. Bishop to e2, king to b1, bishop to g4, and the reason why he plays bishop g4, because he's hoping to hold this diagonal. Now what he's saying is, okay, you can keep improving your king, but I'm holding this square, which means as long as I can wait on this diagonal somewhere here, you can't make progress. But unfortunately, he also has more targets, another weakness. Bishop c2 was played, and bishop f5 was played. And after king to c1, the bishop tried to wait on g6, thinking that, oh, well, if you go here, now I'll give check, and it's not like you can give up the bishop. You can't go to e1. But the bishop goes to b1, and the game is over. Either white gives up a second pawn or allows the king to continue his loop to whirl, and notice that this king cannot prevent anything because he had already committed to the defense of the c-pawn. This is really, really, really instructive stuff. I hope you guys are appreciating the advanced level of this endgame. I've taught this level at a camp where I taught it, where I probably shouldn't have been teaching a group this high. The average rating was over 2250, and I'm, obviously 2450 or so, so certainly qualified, but, they're very close to me, and they learned a lot from this position. This is really instructive stuff. A lot of patience. Just shows this building a bridge, building a bridge mentality. When you keep your goal in mind, did Black calculate all 25 moves of this position to get king c1 and bishop b1, where the position is resignable? Of course not. But by step recognizing his goals and what White's weaknesses were, the position became easier and easier. So that's what happens when Black came. That's what happened when Black came all the way around and won the pawn. He was able to put his bishop on that wonderful square there, on either c2 or b1, attacking the e4 pawn, and the bishop couldn't guard both. So let's back up again and talk about this, especially where White made a critical mistake and made it more easy for us. Certainly did not help himself when he played king f2. So let's say that White played king back to d3, trying to keep the king in a more optimal position. Does it really make a difference? Well, one thing it does is that now that the king is guarding the pawns, now the bishop can be a guy who wreaked havoc. He had the wrong idea trying to make the king wreaking havoc because it turned out the bishop couldn't leave the pawn on c4. But in this position with the king guarding the pawns, after king e7 is played, White plays bishop h5, and on king d8 plays bishop f7, trying to establish the bishop on d5, especially with a pawn on a5, thinking, okay, well, you show me mine, I'll show you yours. You come over here and win this pawn, and guess who's going to win your pawn, right? And by the way, if you offer a trade on bishop c6, I'll capture and double your pawns, and then likely the king and pawn ending may not be winning for you. So king d3 was certainly the best defense. It's called active defense, and I wish I could do an entire video series on active defense, how a lot of the times you just find a way to create the most chaos when you're worse, and it pays off. Maybe your opponent isn't able to deal with it. Maybe they're under time pressure. They offer you a draw, and you've saved a lost position. But Black continued his plan here of king c7. White played bishop g8 to gain a tempo because, why the heck not, for shoots and googles. So bishop d5 was played. Black continued on his journey around the world, still not exactly sure how he was going to break through. But after achieving this position with the king on a6, and White plays king a3, what exactly is the breakthrough that White missed? Now, White did play active defense. I actually think this is much more difficult for Black to break through. By the way, also note that the bishop being on d5, now not only does he guard the pawns, but the pawns also guard him. So, if he can somehow hold Black's king out of the game, maybe he's going to be able to draw now based on the fact that his bishop is better in front of the pawns rather than behind the pawns on these diagonals. So even though that, original intentioned attacking the b7 pawn fails after bishop c8, because on king a4, we have this exclamation mark move, bishop to g4, pointing out the fact that if we can relocate the bishop to d1, keeping the king away, our bishop is going to be able to prove itself even further from there. So here's what happened. King b3 was played. Bishop d1 check is played. The king went to c3. If the king had gone to a3, the bishop would go to c2. Again, keep an eye on all of our weaknesses. Bishop to a4. Bishop back to d1. And guess what? He's in Zugzwang, because now, I guess I should have had you guys calculate. Well, let's see, I haven't revealed it yet. Why don't you, again, I'll take my only other one. After this, we'll finish exactly what Black's winning technique was. What is this idea here, this little waiting maneuver? I mean, obviously, if you take the a5 pawn, you're still losing the b7 pawn. So what was the idea of improving the bishop to that optimal diagonal? I was talking a little too fast, didn't give you a chance to solve it, sorry. So what is the idea here? After bishop d1 and king to b2 was forced, why, I mean, did he just keep retreating the bishop back and forth? Or was there another reason why this is now winning? Okay, we're going to assume you're back, and the reason is obvious, is that now when you take the pawn, your king reaches the b4 square. In any situation where the king was on a3, if his king could hold the third rank and bishop guard both the pawns from d5, you may not be winning here. But by achieving a zugzwang where now when he takes the pawn, the king is not in the optimal position, the endgame is easily lost. Bishop comes back, bishop goes to e2, might as well resign. We're going to win this pawn and repeat kind of a similar story as we saw before, where the king will come over, attack this pawn, the game is obviously over. Again, kind of amazing that in equal material, just having the pawns on light squares became such a huge disadvantage for white. So he didn't play king back to a3. He played the more accurate king to c3, hoping to be able to guard this square. Or he could have, sorry, we actually saw the real game. The analysis says that king c3 was better. However, after bishop to d3, and now king to d3 because of zugzwang, here's the other problem. He chose to stay over here with the pawns rather than let his king get out of play. But now, with the king's inability to guard the a5 pawn, what are we going to do? We're going to bring our bishop back to d7 and to c8, and we're going to win this pawn next move, and rinse and repeat, as we say, just like with shampoo, right, guys? Rinse and repeat. So now we're going to repeat a similar process. Probably put the pawn on b6, bring the bishop to more active diagonals where he creates some havoc, either lets our king in or gets on the pawns. Eventually, we already saw how the axis of the king came in through around the back door, which was very, very instructive. So let's see. Backing up to the beginning, what do we learn from this, and how do we evaluate this position? Again, black's advantage is huge despite the material equality because of all white's targets. This is what chess is all about, guys. I mean, 90% of chess is tactics, is what they always say, right? And that's true because you know what the real definition of a tactic is: any possible trade, or any threat for a possible trade. So it's not like we're talking about 90% of chess is brilliant combinations, okay? Anytime you take a piece or threaten to take a piece, that's by definition of tactics. So yeah, a lot of chess is tactics. But at a high level, the way you outplay somebody is all positional chess. Chess is all strategical, just as Botvinnik said, tactics serve strategy. So when you take the time to set your goals and think about the calculation concepts I'm teaching you here and recognize white's permanent weaknesses, even in an equal position, you see how much of a disadvantage white has here. Really some positional weaknesses that black was able to take his time and target, and using principle of two weaknesses, obviously he was first threatening axis over here, eventually committed axis over here, but by using the bishop to target multiple different pawns, white was never able to set up a successful blockade. And you can review the video and watch it again, but this is one of my favorite endgames actually. I really love the dynamics of how the bishops operate together, especially when pawns are on the same color square as your bishop. Really interesting stuff. And black was able to win pretty easily, and hopefully you will apply these concepts to your own games. Little preview that we're going to continue our Principle of Two Weaknesses lecture. There will be more. And next we're going to get into positions that have weaknesses of the king even. You're combining small positional things as well as attacking the king at the same time. So a little bit more sharp, a little more interesting, but still based on this balance and attacking more than one weakness, continuing to outplay your opponent and not just trading down and simplifying and making your opponent's defense easier. Got to outplay your opponent till it's done. So, okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy the Chess.com videos and hope you enjoyed this, and plenty more to come. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.